In my previous video about great people who did some not so great things, we concluded that no one can be perfectly good, and even the greatest among us have done some pretty awful stuff. This naturally made me curious about the opposite question. Who are the bad people in history, and what good, if any, did they do? Is it even possible to find something positive about those who are widely considered to be the worst people humanity has to offer? Or is there such thing as a perfectly evil person? And I don't just mean a nice side effect of something they did, like how some people jokingly say that Genghis Khan reduced global warming because of how many people he killed. No, I'm looking for actions they did that were actually good in and of itself. But even if we do find something good in these notoriously evil people, this doesn't at all excuse the fact that they're still terrible human beings, and nothing nice said about them will ever diminish the awfulness of their actions. Just as how you can criticize great figures in history without dismissing their achievements, you can also learn something positive about terrible people without excusing their evil deeds. So with that said, join me as we attempt to find something good about every evil person. We'll start off strong with the man of steel, Joseph Stalin, who ruled the Soviet Union for nearly 30 years up until his death in 1953. Stalin's regime was responsible for deporting millions of its own citizens to labor camps, executing hundreds of thousands of his perceived enemies, ordering unwarranted detention and torture of suspected civilians, and exacerbating famines that killed millions of his own people. It is therefore no surprise that Stalin is widely considered to be one of history's most brutal tyrants, with few leaders in the 20th century outmatching the scale of his atrocities. But despite all his faults, Stalin managed to transform a poor, rural, backwards nation into an industrialized superpower second only to that of the United States. Literacy rates increased from 25% before the Soviet Union to 94% halfway through Stalin's reign, and life expectancy by the time he died was more than double what it was pre-revolution. But perhaps Stalin's greatest accomplishment that many Russians today still admire him for was his victory over the Nazis in the Great Patriotic War, more commonly known to us in the West as World War II. Putting aside the slightly inconvenient bit about him purging his own army right before the war, and his less than optimal military decisions that led to millions of Soviets needlessly dying, Stalin's regime still deserves praise for bearing most of the burden in the Second World War. Under his leadership, 27 million Soviets sacrificed their lives fighting bravely against the Nazis, and is basically the reason why this video is in English und nicht Deutsch. Danke, Stalin. After defeating Hitler, Stalin then oversaw the beginning of a Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States that spanned much of the 20th century, until the USSR's downfall in 1991. A popular phrase expressed by many Americans at the time was that the end of history had arrived, and the United States won, beating Nazi Germany and then the Soviet Union. That America would enter the 21st century without any more enemies, and create a world full of wonderful liberal democracies, guided by the only superpower left standing. But this American dream would come crashing down to reality just 1 year, 9 months, and 11 days into the new millennium thanks to a man by the name of Osama bin Laden, the mastermind behind the horrific attacks that killed nearly 3,000 American citizens, instantly becoming the deadliest terrorist event in US history. After 9/11, Osama started playing hide-and-seek with the American government, and it took 10 years before he was finally tracked down and killed in his bunker in Pakistan. Thanks, Obama. And here is where we can maybe find something good about Osama, since his personal hard drive was seized after the raid and declassified. After going through his files, we were able to discover that he had written letters calling for Americans to save humanity by helping to fight climate change. For the 10th anniversary of 9/11, he apparently asked his team to launch a media campaign that included an urgent plea for the world to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions. It's nice to learn that between every terrorist attack he planned, he always made sure to voice his concern about the planet heating up as well. There were some other interesting things discovered on his hard drive too. From what we can tell, Osama was an epic gamer, enjoying titles like Counter-Strike, Mario, and Animal Crossing. He also watched Naruto and Dragon Balls, as well as having this video saved which he called Foonie Cats 4, with the Shrek theme song as its background.
Somebody once told me so much to do, so much. Hey now, you're an all-star.
Bin Laden forever changed the world for the worse because of his terrorism, and is the reason why, to this day, a miserable airport worker will scream at you for using too many bins, or harass you for having a bottle of shampoo with more than 3 ounces. So the next time the TSA is searching your balls for a hidden bomb, remember to say, "Thanks, Osama." But he's also the reason why the American government went into full panic mode after 9/11 and invaded a country that had nothing to do with the attacks because of the new axis of evil, consisting of Iran, Iraq, and North Korea. Which leads us to our next villain, Kim Jong Il. Not to be confused with his spoiled son and current leader Kim Jong-un, or his father who created North Korea, Kim Il-sung. While obviously subjective, it's reasonable to argue that out of the 3 leaders in North Korea's history, Kim Jong-il was probably the worst. He somehow had both Stalin's disdain for human suffering, as well as Osama's cold-blooded ruthlessness toward innocent civilians. Like Stalin, he completely neglected millions of his own citizens who were starving to death, stubbornly insisting that North Korea's glorious Juche, or self-reliance ideology, would be able to feed everyone without help from other nations. It wasn't until the country turned into hell on earth and people resorting to eating grass, bark, and rats to survive when the government finally admitted to the world that they did indeed have food shortages and begged for the much needed aid. And like Osama, he was also responsible for the horrific Flight 858 terrorist attack, where a bomb was planted in a South Korean commercial airplane that killed all 100 passengers on board. Additionally, thousands of South Koreans, as well as dozens of Japanese citizens, have been kidnapped over the decades under Kim Jong-il's orders. Despite all these crimes against humanity, here are some good things Kim Jong-il did throughout his life. For one, whether it was out of sheer necessity or a genuine interest to improve the conditions of his people, he began to allow some economic reforms, following China's model of opening up special economic zones in the country, where a little bit of good old capitalism can function there. He was also interested in finally making amends with South Korea, and cooperated with their so-called Sunshine Policy, where both states would strengthen communication with each other and work together on several business ventures to help the North's stagnant economy. Still, Kim Jong-il's brutality towards his own people and his willingness to commit terrorism abroad makes him the worst leader in North Korea's history. But surprisingly, he's not the first pseudo-socialist leader with the cult of personality almost as unhinged as Taylor Swift's. Believe it or not, that would be an American pastor by the name of Jim Jones, architect of the infamous Jonestown Massacre. What started off as just one of many hippie groups that were popular in the 60s took things for the worse when Jones decided to relocate his nearly 1,000 followers to any communist nation that would take them in. China and the Soviet Union rejected his request, but Guyana, which had recently formed a left-wing government, was sympathetic to his cause and allowed his cult to move in. Upon arrival, he declared this new commune to be called Jonestown, a paradise on earth. Which, by the way, if anyone ever declares a place to be a paradise, please just run away. But one positive aspect about Mr. Jones was his genuine and unapologetic support for racial minorities, perhaps a result of either his socialist ideology or religious beliefs. Regardless of the reason, Jones was at the forefront of Indiana's civil rights movement, helping to racially integrate churches, restaurants, the police, and hospitals throughout the state. When swastikas were painted on the homes of 2 black families, the pastor comforted them and implored for other households to not move away. He helped set up sting operations to catch businesses who refused to serve black customers and directly confronted neo-Nazis trying to stop him. It was for this reason why the man was able to attract such a large following in the first place, with much of his cult consisting of racial minorities who admired Jones for his truly brave actions against injustice. But fast forward back to the South American commune, where his cult was toiling away and starving for the past year. By this point, Father, as Jones was called, had implemented North Korea's system of 8 hours work followed by 8 hours of study, which was basically just him ranting to everyone about the evils of America and reading political commentary from communist nations. Hunger and disease were widespread, since the land where the commune was established wasn't fertile enough to grow a sufficient amount of food, and a lack of trained medical staff meant that no one was able to properly treat the sick. As a result, the town quickly became a glorified concentration camp in the middle of nowhere and had to entirely rely on the social security checks elderly members were receiving in order to buy enough rice, beans, and some vegetables to keep everyone alive. Of course, that didn't stop Father Jones from stealing some of that sweet welfare money from his brother, Uncle Sam, to keep his personal fridge stocked with meat, eggs, fruit, and even his favorite sodas. Over the course of a year living in paradise, Jones was getting increasingly paranoid that the American government was going to come for him any day now. And that fear reached its peak when a group consisting of a US congressman, reporters, and relatives of cult members came to the compound and found a weird but seemingly harmless hippie camp. As they headed back to America, around a dozen members defected and asked the team to take them back home. Jones reluctantly let them go, but secretly ordered armed loyalists to follow and kill the entire group before they left Guyana, shooting at them as they were boarding their planes. 5 people were killed, including the congressman, but the rest were able to escape into the jungle and were eventually rescued by the local government. Immediately after ordering the attack, Jones knew his political project was now officially over and ordered his followers to commit what he called revolutionary by drinking Kool-Aid laced with cyanide. People were breaking down and crying as they realized what they were now instructed to do, and the camp guards killed anyone who dared to refuse. Nearly 1,000 people in Jonestown were not just persuaded to end their own lives, but also their children's. And when outsiders arrived at the deadly scene, the people's paradise, now littered with countless dead bodies, looked like the aftermath of a Mongol invasion, because no one could have left a scene more gruesome than Genghis Khan, the quintessential archetype of a barbaric warlord. The Mongol leader is best known for rapidly creating the largest contiguous empire in human history, through deadly conquests, massacres, and pillaging. As mentioned at the start of this video, Genghis Khan's indiscriminate annihilation of any population who resisted meant that an estimated 10% of the entire world's population was killed. 1 in 10 people died under the Mongols. To put it in perspective, 3% of the world's population died in the Second World War, which means we would need 3 World War IIs back to back to back to even come close to the scale of human life loss that Genghis Khan brought onto this earth. You may wonder, how exactly did he conquer so much in such a short time? Well, ancient terrorism, basically. The Mongols much preferred to have their enemies unconditionally surrender and become vassal states for the empire, so they could receive regular tributes instead of just pillaging them for a one-time bounty. What can I say? Bro was on that passive income grind. The Mongol ruler invented biological warfare by taking corpses infected with the Black Plague and catapulting them into cities under siege. His military strategy was so ruthless that most places simply chose to surrender. And if a single person tried to resist, Genghis Khan's horde would mass murder every male and enslave the women for... well, I'll let Genghis explain it himself.
From Poland to Korea, Arabic to land. Now my DNA's in dudes from New York to Japan. Ha!
But as with any notorious person in history, Genghis Khan wasn't without his positives. For one, the Mongols were revolutionary when it came to tolerating different faiths and cultures in their domain. Up until that point, pretty much every empire would force conquered populations to convert to their religion or be killed. Genghis also introduced systems of meritocracy within his government and military, established a postal network across continents which spread knowledge around the world, and created an unprecedented peace throughout Eurasia, now known as the Pax Mongolica. But 40 to 80 million people paid the price for all this to happen, a number so large that it would take another 700 years before someone else came close to causing this much death. And that someone would be none other than Mao Zedong, communist revolutionary and founder of modern-day China. Now, it would be wrong to believe that the deaths Mao caused were in any way comparable to Genghis Khan, since Mao's case was mostly due to his failed policies, paranoia, and gross negligence. But in Genghis's case, it was just cold-blooded murder. Still, that doesn't excuse the inhumane lack of concern Mao had for the people he ruled, and letting tens of millions of them die because of a stubborn commitment to uphold an ideology is still pretty evil. Mao's tenure as leader of China started off with great promise, but quickly turned into a disaster when he implemented his infamous Great Leap Forward campaign, forcing millions of farmers to stop growing food so they could make steel in the hopes of selling it abroad to generate more money for the revolution. This had double the horrible result, since it turns out ordering a bunch of farmers to try to make steel out of makeshift furnaces in their homes just results in garbage tier unusable metal you can't sell. And oh, those farmers weren't farming, so now you also just starved tens of millions of people to death. After Mao's little oopsie, senior party officials finally decided to rein him in a bit and reduce his control of the country. But Chairman Mao's ego was too strong for their weak attempt to restrain him, and he subsequently launched the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, which was mostly just an excuse for Mao to consolidate his own power, enforce a permanent cult of personality around him, and purge the nation of undesirables, or basically anyone who he thought was against him. Mao's reign wasn't all bad, however. In fact, many Chinese people today believe that the Great Helmsman, as he was called, was 70% correct and 30% wrong, a phrase that was originally uttered by Mao himself when he assessed the legacy of Stalin. Before the communists took over China, the nation had been a rigid, outdated society that was restrained by thousands of years of strict Confucian philosophy. Compared to the growing but still insufficient freedom women had in many other countries at the time, Chinese women held even fewer rights, with forced marriages being the norm and divorce only available if the man wanted it.
Hey, come here, look at me. Hey, look at me. What'd I say? No. Come here, look at me. Hey, look at me. No. Come here, look at me. Hey, look at me. What'd I say? No. Come here, look at, look at, you wanna get, no.
Additionally, 90% of the population were peasants who were often forced to pay insanely high rents to oppressive landlords, causing hundreds of millions to suffer generation after generation, dynasty after dynasty. When the communists took over China, Mao completely eliminated the landlord class, both figuratively and literally. As a modern-day peasant myself, I have to admit that I sometimes have a bit of Mao in me every time the landlord raises my rent. And because of silly things in life like housing, food, and gas, this might actually be the last time I'm able to make a video of this kind. The unfortunate truth is that videos like these take thousands of hours of me researching, writing, recording, coming up with stupid memes to make you blow air out of your nose, sourcing thousands of documents and footage from archives and libraries, and spending countless nights putting everything together. Unlike bigger YouTubers who can afford to have a team of 10 people so they can publish videos 10 times more often, everything you see here is done by just one person, me. Frankly, YouTube and sponsors don't really care about how much time and effort a video takes. They just want creators to pump out as much easy slop as possible to make the most amount of money. But I don't worship money, which is why I don't want to spam you guys with mindless garbage that takes zero effort. I want to spend the extra time to make the best content I can. For you, the viewer. The only problem is that without your help, it's just economically impossible for me to keep doing this. And it doesn't help that I make videos about war, tragedy, death, politics, as well as past and current issues that are deemed controversial and therefore have had and will continue to have my videos demonetized. There's a reason why ad-friendly YouTubers outnumber creators like me by 1,000,000 to 1, and I don't blame them at all. If they make videos like mine, they wouldn't be able to survive either. My only hope is that enough of you watching can help me keep a roof over my head while I continue to make more videos for you to enjoy. So if you are one of the special few who can make a real and positive impact to someone's life, please consider supporting me on Patreon or YouTube, where you'll get early access to new videos, have your name shouted out to millions of people, and get exclusive content after every video. Now back to Mao. Furthermore, the Chinese writing system was more or less the same for over 2,000 years, making it completely impractical for any ordinary citizen to be literate. Opium use was widespread and ruined people of all social classes, regardless of wealth. Thanks to Chairman Mao, archaic rules for society were abolished, healthcare and education became accessible to the masses, and the government encouraged women to participate in politics and work in roles that were previously only reserved for men. A popular phrase by Mao was that women hold up half the sky, something that Biden apparently loves to quote. Based. The chairman is admired by many in China for finally unifying a country that had been plagued by civil wars and foreign invasions for over a century, an achievement neither the previous nationalist government nor Qing dynasty ever accomplished. One of the most impactful decisions Mao made was at the end of his life, when he met with President Richard Nixon, drastically altering the global world order and permanently shifting the balance of power from the Soviet Union to China. Mao's historic summit paved the way for the People's Republic to break into the international scene and finally establish itself as the one true China. This meeting, however, could not have been possible without the help of one particular American, who had secretly visited China the year before, in order to set up this event in the first place. That person, today considered to be an old friend of the Chinese people, was Henry Kissinger, the man who forever changed America and its relationship with the world. When touring Southeast Asia, the late Anthony Bourdain famously wrote, "Once you've been to Cambodia, you'll never stop wanting to beat Henry Kissinger to death with your bare hands." And it wasn't just Cambodia. You see, as President Nixon's Secretary of State, Kissinger managed to gain unprecedented power over America's foreign policy during the Cold War in the 70s. With Nixon's trust, this meant that Kissinger was able to control much of what the United States did abroad, and his unapologetically amoral realpolitik philosophy resulted in decisions that can be categorized as nothing short of war crimes, all in the name of advancing American interests. Some of his greatest hits include his involvement with illegally bombing Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, overthrowing the democratically elected leader of Chile and installing a military dictator in his place, supporting Indonesia's invasion and occupation of East Timor, greenlighting state terrorism and death squads in Argentina, and straight up funding a genocide in Bangladesh. Each one of these events directly led to decades of dysfunction, misery, and violence for hundreds of millions of people around the world, with many still suffering the effects of Kissinger's policies to this day. And perhaps the most astonishing fact of this all is that Mr. Kissinger managed to win a Nobel Peace Prize for his incredible, totally not psychopathic work in Vietnam. Kissinger and his ideology are a large reason why many nations outside the West continue to distrust the United States to this day. Those in the West, however, view him as a great statesman who simply acted in the best interest of America. What they can say about Kissinger is that he helped to establish a détente with the Soviet Union and negotiated nuclear arms control agreements between the two superpowers. And while his help in opening up China led to serious side effects for the US, it undeniably resulted in over 1 billion people being able to climb out of extreme poverty. Also, on the more personal side, Kissinger was a Jewish child growing up in Nazi Germany and managed to escape the country with his family just a year before World War II began. Regardless of how you feel about who he came to be, it is indeed admirable that a boy who was persecuted by the Nazis grew up to become a man who fought against the very same regime. But I will conclude by quoting from the same paragraph I began with. Witness what Henry did in Cambodia, the fruits of his genius for statesmanship, and you will never understand why he's not sitting in the dock at The Hague next to Milosevic. While Henry continues to nibble nori rolls and ramaki at A-list parties, Cambodia, the neutral nation he secretly and illegally bombed, invaded, undermined, and then threw to the dogs, is still trying to raise itself up on its one remaining leg. What Anthony Bourdain is referring to was not just America's bombardment of Cambodia, which itself killed hundreds of thousands of civilians, but what also happened as a result. Thanks to Kissinger, what was once a fringe, minor communist movement in Cambodia exponentially grew more and more popular as Cambodians continued to be senselessly killed in these bombing campaigns. And the leader of this insurgency that eventually took control of the country was a man no one had heard of, who went by the name Pol Pot. Considering that I already made an entire video on the horrors of this man, we can mostly focus on whatever good I found about him. But to quickly recap in case you forgot, Pol Pot was leader of the Khmer Rouge, a Cambodian communist party that became popular after Nixon, taking Kissinger's advice, indiscriminately bombed Cambodia, which allowed them to eventually win a civil war against the American-backed Cambodian government at the time. After taking power, Pol Pot enacted a series of disastrous policies that forcibly cleansed millions of people from the cities to the countryside in order to create an agrarian paradise on Earth. Given that these supposed urban demons hadn't developed any skills related to farming, and that there was no infrastructure, planning, or feasible way to suddenly have millions of people live in the countryside, starvation was widespread throughout the 4 years under the Khmer Rouge. But starving was honestly the least of their worries, since from the top down, Pol Pot was maniacally paranoid of foreigners, ethnic minorities, and his own people, which meant that everyone left and right were accused of subverting the revolution and forced to produce false confessions of their supposed allegiances to the Americans, Soviets, or Vietnamese, all of whom were Pol Pot's foes. By the way, if you somehow found yourself being hated by both America and the Soviet Union, you probably messed up. After torturing and killing enough ethnic minorities, class enemies, and Cambodians, the Khmer Rouge started killing off factions of their own group within the organization, with everyone from Pol Pot himself to the lowest ranking cadre paranoid of being purged and killed next. Seriously, check out my video on this entire subject. My short explanation here doesn't even come close to describing just how insane Pol Pot's Cambodia was. With that in mind, it is especially difficult to find anything this man did in his life that could be considered remotely good. A close contender would be the fact that despite absolutely having the power to do so, Pol Pot wasn't all that interested in building a cult of personality like his fellow comrades Mao, Stalin, or Kim Il-sung. One reason for this could be the fact that he reportedly found joy in deceiving others and remaining elusive, often going by various pseudonyms and lying about himself to other people. That, or it was his sincere hatred for individualism. So the only good thing about Pol Pot seems to be his surprisingly compassionate treatment toward his wife and especially daughter, who still expresses fond memories of her father to this day. I guess even the worst of us can still have the capacity to love someone. Even now, Cambodians continue to suffer from the illegal bombing of their country and subsequent Khmer Rouge regime that followed. Because of Pol Pot, in less than 4 long years, up to a third of Cambodians tragically died, with the remaining survivors seriously injured, starving, imprisoned, or displaced from their homes. Pol Pot is therefore rightfully considered to be one of the deadliest dictators in human history, with pretty much no one else outmatching the proportion of deaths he caused. Okay, there might actually be one more person who can compete with Pol Pot in terms of deadliness. That would be King Leopold II, ruler of Belgium and her territories abroad. And that last part is especially important, since he's most notorious for having committed some of the worst atrocities in history against the people living in his colony. During the European scramble for Africa, Belgium was no exception, and the king wanted first dibs on an area in Central Africa, calling it the Congo Free State. Leopold convinced the international community that his goal was to provide humanitarian assistance to the region and bring civilization to the population. But in reality, this free state was more of a sick private venture of his, enslaving millions of people to extract as much wealth as possible for his own personal fortune. The king would rent out pieces of the colony to private corporations and give them free rein to basically do whatever they want in their land to maximize their profits. With an explicit blessing from Leopold, these companies effectively turned their local populations into slave labor in order to exploit the region's rubber, a resource that was in high demand at the time. Anyone who refused to work for the corporations could be killed, and entire villages would be wiped out to coerce the rest to comply. For those who complied and became Leopold's slaves, life was hardly any better. Everyone was obligated to meet extremely demanding quotas, and failing to harvest enough rubber was punishable by death. King Leopold wanted to run the colony as cheaply as possible, which meant that wasting precious supplies was a big no-no. This mentality went all the way down to the bullets hired soldiers would use against the enslaved population. In order to ensure that these mercenaries weren't misusing them to hunt for food or sell for money, every bullet fired required a right hand to be brought to their superiors as proof that it was used for the right purpose, which was to maintain Leopold's plantation and kill anyone who resisted. But why their right hand? Well, smartphones weren't a thing yet, so the soldiers couldn't just DM their boss a photo of the person they shot, and dragging the entire body back to base wasn't really practical either. So they figured, if you could bring back someone's right hand, it's pretty reasonable to assume that you did indeed use a bullet on them. As a result of this atrocious policy, severed hands quickly became a form of currency to compensate for using bullets or even failing to provide enough rubber. Soldiers who were in charge of collecting harvest quotas often resorted to cutting off the hands of innocent victims, so they themselves would avoid being punished when they didn't bring the required amount of rubber. Family members would be kidnapped and taken as hostage to force people to work. Villages that fell behind their quotas would have their leaders imprisoned. Starvation was widespread, since anyone able-bodied was now forced to extract rubber instead of producing food, and companies would often steal the few remaining crop and farm animals for themselves. Children were kidnapped to be workers or soldiers. Cannibalism from Leopold's army was tolerated since it helped to instill fear and discourage rebellion. For over 20 years, King Leopold took an area that today would be the 10th largest country in the world and transformed it into a dystopian nightmare that somehow combined the brutal efficiency of a corporation with the lethal power of a state. If it wasn't for his desire to have his own colony and make more money, King Leopold II could have very likely been remembered for the many buildings and projects he commissioned throughout his 44 years of reign. To this day, many of the works he built still stands in Belgium, and his nickname at the time was the Builder King. But ultimately, Leopold's actions in the Congo represent everything wrong with colonialism, and serves as a textbook example of the system failing to provide any benefit to the people living there, only enriching the foreign power that took control. What's especially disturbing about King Leopold is that he never once stepped foot in his own colony that he turned to hell. At the cost of up to 10 million lives, or roughly half its population, Leopold was able to profit 70 million francs throughout his reign of terror in the Congo. But 70 million, even adjusted for inflation, is nothing compared to the $70 billion that was amassed by the most notorious drug lord in the world, Pablo Escobar. Considered to be one of the wealthiest criminals in history, Escobar grew up in poverty and started off his life of crime with the small stuff, selling illegal cigarettes and fake lottery tickets, as well as engaging in petty theft. Over time, however, as Pablo yearned for more money, power, and prestige, he became involved with more violent crimes such as kidnapping and killing people. However, it wasn't until the emergence of the cocaine trade when Escobar began to distinguish himself from the rest of the criminal world, realizing there was a massive opportunity to take control of this lucrative drug that was flowing into his home country of Colombia, and finding a way to export it to the United States. Through his natural leadership skills, logistical brilliance, and sheer ruthlessness, Pablo Escobar and his Medellin cartel rapidly dominated this new global cocaine trade, moving 15 tons of it into the United States every day, earning him and his cartel as much as $420 million every single week. For those too lazy to do the math, that's about $22 billion a year, which, if his cartel was a proper business, would have made it the 10th largest corporation in the entire world at that time. And he had the wealth to back it up too, having been consistently ranked by Forbes to be among the 10 richest people in the world. It's pretty easy to hide thousands of dollars of unreported tips you earned from your customer service job. Hell, it's not even that hard to store $1 million as long as you're careful enough. But just like how 1,000,000 seconds is 12 days and 1,000,000,000 seconds is 31 years, $1 billion is much more difficult to hide from the government. With this in mind, what do you do when you're getting billions and billions and billions of dollars flowing in every single year, where you have so much dirty money that you genuinely can't figure out how to store all of it? Well, that was exactly Escobar's problem, since he couldn't just tuck his money away in a bank, instead having to resort to stashing piles of cash in abandoned warehouses, farms, and even in the walls of cartel members' homes. As a result, Pablo had to write off 10% of the money he was making every year because of water damage, rats eating the cash, and a variety of other factors that simply come with hiding that much money. Just doing some quick maths allows us to estimate that he basically lost $2.2 billion every year, which means the amount of money he was losing to rats and the weather was equivalent to the GDP of Congo, or 3 entire Cambodias. With all this money he had, you may have assumed that Escobar just spent it all on himself and his family. And yes, he definitely did all the typical things that people with too much money do, like building his own personal theme park, having an enormous supercar collection, importing hundreds of exotic animals for entertainment. You get the point. The man lived a life of luxury fit for a king, but he also undeniably contributed significant amounts of his wealth to his local community, spending millions on projects including the construction of schools, housing, and recreation centers for the poor. Regardless of whether this was a genuine expression of his love for the people or just a cynical way to bolster his public image and political ambitions, many Colombians admired the man for doing more for their lives than their own government ever did, despite the ruthlessness of his criminal activities. No one in Colombia could stop him at the height of his power, with his well-known policy of plata o plomo, Spanish for silver or lead, ensuring that everyone from the police, to the judges, to the politicians were either bribed or, if they refused, murdered. Call it arrogance from his success. Call it anger that he got kicked out of politics. Call it the inevitable fate of a drug lord gone too big. But eventually, the king of cocaine's actions got too out of control for even the corrupt Colombian government to ignore. By this point, he and his cartel had murdered 4 presidential candidates, 60 judges, 200 court officials, and 1,000 policemen, with some estimates totaling 60,000 people dying in his hands. He infamously ordered the bombings of a commercial flight and the national security headquarters in an attempt to assassinate 2 targets, but failed to do so and just ended up injuring and killing thousands of innocent lives. The government finally had enough, forcing Escobar and his family to go into hiding. Pablo's son recalled a night when they ran out of fuel, but still had plenty of money with them, so his father started a fire with $2 million worth of cash to keep his sister warm. You know you somehow messed up in life when the money you have is only worth as much as the paper it's made out of. Eventually, the king of cocaine met his fateful end when the government finally located his hideout and raided the place. His death created a power vacuum not just in Colombia, but every country that was connected to the global cocaine trade. Naturally, this led to gang wars around the world, all vying for a piece of the Escobar pie. Now, starting gang wars is one thing, but starting a world war? There's only one person in history that laid the groundwork for such a catastrophic event to occur and then triggered it to happen. A man so hated that my inclusion of him will cause more controversy than everyone else in this video combined. A man so evil that it may be incomprehensible that he could ever do something good in his life. A man so wicked that his name is now synonymous with the devil himself. I am, of course, talking about Adolf Hitler. Now, for those of you who skipped to this part, you know who you are. I just want to say, history ain't all about Hitler. There are so many interesting people that I covered in this video, and I hope you were able to learn about them too. But yeah, Hitler. What can I say about a man that hasn't already been said by so many others? We all know him, of course, for being the dictator of Nazi Germany, starting World War II by invading Poland and committing a systematic genocide against Jews, Slavs, Romani, and other minority groups considered to be Untermenschen, or subhuman. What makes Hitler's actions uniquely evil was his genuine intention to murder every single group he considered undesirable. Unlike many others I've mentioned, where they could hide behind the excuse of killing people because they were disloyal, or refused to surrender, or didn't work hard enough, Hitler had no real excuse. He simply viewed them, particularly Jews, as those who inherently shouldn't exist, and just being alive in the Führer's world was a crime punishable by death. Now, when it comes to finding something good about the man, I'm not gonna do a Kanye and claim that Hitler invented highways or the microphone or whatever other nonsense he said.
I am Adolf Hitler, command of the Third Reich. Little known fact, also dope on the mic.
But surprisingly, Nazi Germany was weirdly progressive when it came to their treatment of animals. Despite his complete lack of empathy for human beings, Hitler became a committed vegetarian and strongly supported animal rights, an issue not too many people cared about at the time. After taking power in 1933, Germany became the first nation in the world to ban vivisection and protect wolves from being hunted. Animals could no longer be slaughtered without the use of anesthetics, and boiling lobsters and crabs became illegal. In true Nazi fashion, anyone who was caught violating these laws could be sent to a concentration camp. So in a twisted way, Hitler treated animals like people, and people like animals. Lastly, perhaps his greatest achievement, which saved the world a lot of time, money, and blood, was shooting a well-placed bullet at himself. But you know who definitely didn't commit suicide?
Would you please state your full name?
I'm Jeffrey Edward Epstein, and my residence address is 6100 Red Hook Boulevard in Virgin Islands.
Infamous for abusing and trafficking children to powerful men around the world, Epstein is now considered to be one of the most vile human beings in recent history. For decades, the New York financier would provide underage girls to politicians, businessmen, and social elites to gain power and influence, which might explain how a former high school teacher just coincidentally became a billionaire with private jets and a personal island. Looks like Walter White trafficked the wrong product. When he was finally being brought to justice in court, it was revealed that Epstein had secretly taped hundreds of these influential men with underage girls for blackmail. This fact absolutely, definitely has nothing to do with the two guards watching him both falling asleep and then getting caught lying about it, or the prison violating its own procedures by transferring his cellmate away right before his death, or both cameras filming who could enter and leave Epstein's cell somehow malfunctioning and erasing its footage because of technical errors. No, none of that has anything to do with the fact that Epstein had compromising information on some of the most powerful people in the world, and I'm definitely not making any insinuation that this conspiracy theory could be true. Look, I don't want to end up like a Boeing employee. But anyway, as much as this pains me to say, I somehow managed to find something good he did. Over the course of his life, Epstein donated some of his wealth to various causes through his Jeffrey Epstein VI Foundation, which, by the way, you might have thought, wow, this Jeff guy was at least cool enough to set up 6 foundations. No, the VI stood for Virgin Islands, which was where his infamous Epstein Island was located. Through his wonderful charity, he funded research on weird transhumanist subjects like genetic engineering, eugenics, and even freezing bodies to resurrect them in the future, otherwise known as cryonics. But surprisingly, he also donated millions of dollars to science programs at Harvard and MIT. I must say though, it's a little weird knowing that spoiled rich kids in elite colleges were funded by someone who made their money from exploiting impoverished children. Many of us prefer to imagine that people like Epstein and others I've mentioned are completely separate from normal human beings, that they almost aren't even real people. And some may be upset at the way I've humanized them, that I am somehow bringing them back up to our level of dignity, when they ought to stay below us for all the evil they've done to this world. But before they became the awful people we now know them for, Pablo Escobar was studying to be a lawyer. Mao was a librarian. Hitler was an aspiring artist. Stalin went to religious school to become a priest. Bin Laden attended Oxford and was a proud Arsenal fan. So my point here is actually the opposite, that we as the normal or good people ought not to have the hubris to assume that we could never become the monster they became. That even if we were to have the wrong upbringing, experience the wrong events, and make the wrong decisions, we could still never end up like them. It's awfully easy to just declare that there are evil people, and then there's the rest of us. But it's a little too convenient to be true. As a child, I always wondered how it was possible for millions of Germans, Cambodians, Japanese, Soviets, Chinese, Americans, honestly, every society in history, could have been complicit in the evil that occurred in their time, when most of them were either apathetic to injustices they saw, or outright participating in the creation of their very own hell. But growing up is realizing that these people were mostly regular folks like you and I, just conditioned, convinced, or coerced into committing these acts. The difficult truth is that many of us, in fact, most of us, would have also overseen the same evil as the generations of our past, and hardly any would be the special few in history who risked and often sacrificed their lives in order to do what they thought was right. It is from this reality that I point to when saying that you and I are not as different from the bad guys as you may think. Yes, there are indeed exceedingly evil people in history that stand out from the rest of us. But Pol Pot didn't personally crush those children's skulls. Hitler didn't personally operate those gas chambers. And Mao didn't personally execute those intellectuals. Behind every one of these figures were millions of people who chose the easy way, the biologically logical way, to conform to those above and around them. We will face the wrong way in an elevator when seeing people do the same. We will deny our own eyes when others insist on a different reality. We will just follow orders when an authority instructs us to harm, and choose to harm when given authority. We will like and subscribe when a YouTuber asks us to do so. Please like and subscribe. This video took me forever to make, and I'd really appreciate if you can support me on Patreon. Thank you. We will even drink the Kool-Aid, as we now say, and feed it to our children, even if we know that it'll kill them, all in the pursuit to serve our hardwired tendency to conform. Sorry for the less than happy turn, but we are talking about the worst people here. So just as my previous video explored those who represent the very best of what we're able to achieve, this one serves to explore those who became the very worst of our humanity. Together, they form both parts of a central thesis on the nature of who we are, which is that no one is perfectly good, but no one is perfectly bad either. It's up to us to achieve our greatest potential in life, to try to be the best version of ourselves while remaining vigilant to our tremendous capacity for evil. These videos are impossible to make without the generosity of viewers like yourself. Even just a bit of support from enough people can make all the difference to my channel's survival. So if you'd like to make a real impact by helping me create more content like this, please consider supporting me on Patreon or YouTube, linked here and in the description below. Thanks for sticking to the end, and a special thank you to my patrons who allowed me to create this very video you're watching.